What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nerdy Professor Podcast, your hot spot for everything black, bold, and beautiful. I'm your host, the Nerdy Professor, and on this episode, we're going to discuss the beginnings of slavery during the colonial period, the conditions Black Americans faced, and how Black Americans defied oppression up to the American Revolution. Let's get into it. All right, I want y'all to imagine going to the Nerdy Professor game shop, aka GameStop, and picking up a brand new From Software game, turning it on for the first time, and consequently getting your ass kicked. I think going to colonial America had to be like playing a Dark Souls or Elden Ring on the hardest difficulty with no tutorial. We all know those games are filled with epic boss battles, interesting level design, and that they are extremely hard for new people. Like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, beginning a new life in colonial America came with crazy challenges, like harsh environments, food shortages, health risks, isolation, distance, and conflict with the indigenous Americans. Like any From Software game, these early colonists had to be strategic in their approach, time their actions, and have a little bit of luck. Otherwise, they would end up dead and no redos. There was no established legal or political system and no clear guidance on how to navigate the complex relationship with indigenous people, nor their home European countries. The first settlers in the colonies were rejects. People looking to start over, people looking for money. They were separatists and Puritans, entrepreneurs, criminals, indentured servants, and African slaves, each of which had their own motivation to be in the American colonies, except for the African slaves who were forced to migrate. Whether it be economic opportunities, religious freedom, or escaping political or religious prosecution. Okay, with that scene set, and us knowing how difficult it was for early colonists, let's move on. Colonial America was a mixture of cultures, economies, and political structures established by European powers, including, as we know, England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal. In New England, the economy relied on fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and later manufacturing. The middle colonies earned the nickname breadbasket due to their agricultural output of wheat and corn alongside trade and manufacturing activities. Meanwhile, the southern colonies were dominated by plantation agriculture, specifically crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo, heavily relied on enslaved labor. The colonies were founded on principles of religious freedom, attracting diverse groups seeking tolerance, such as the Puritans in Massachusetts and Quakers in Pennsylvania. Native American cultures persisted alongside European traditions, influencing language, food, and customs. Society in colonial America was ordered, with wealthy landowners, merchants, and political elites at the top. Below were the artisans, craftsmen, and small farmers. Enslaved Africans and Native Americans occupied the lowest rungs, enduring harsh conditions and limited rights. Colonial governments developed varying degrees of autonomy from the European sponsors, with early forms of representative government emerging, such as the Virginia House of Burgess and New England town meetings, laying the groundwork for democratic ideas. Colonists interacted with Native American tribes through trade alliances and occasional conflicts over land and resources. Treaties and agreements were made and broken, leading to tensions and the displacement of the native population. Urban centers like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston grew as hubs of trade, commerce, and cultural exchange. Towns developed around agricultural and industrial centers serving as local economic and social hubs. Enlightenment ideas spread throughout colonial America, promoting reason, science, and individual rights. Print culture flourished with newspaper, pamphlets, and books disseminating their ideas and shaping public opinions during this transformative period. In 1619, the first recorded slaves arrived in an English colony in Jamestown, Virginia, at Port Comfort. This would mark the beginning of chattel slavery in the New World. Early settlers faced labor shortages. The issue of labor shortages among early European settlers in the Americas was a significant challenge that shaped the colonies. The early European attempts to use Native American labor on plantations and in mines were often unsuccessful due to high mortality rates from diseases that the population had no prior exposure to or immunity to, such as smallpox, the flu, and measles. Also, Native Americans' resistance to enslavement was another factor that led to the labor shortages. This resistance sometimes led to conflicts and warfare, which further complicated efforts to establish a stable labor force. The early struggles with Native Americans led the early European settlers to turn to enslaved Africans. Now, enslaved Africans were perceived as a more reliable labor force because they were less susceptible to the diseases that decimated Native American populations. The early European settlers' labor shortage led them to increasingly rely on the transatlantic slave trade for enslaved Africans as a more reliable workforce. Europeans soon decided to codify slavery in order to increase longevity and effective returns on their economic venture to gain wealth and prosperity during the colonial period. As I said before, the use of indentured servants wasn't viable for Europeans because 1, other Europeans were still seen as full humans. 2, the settlers were in somewhat constant conflict with Native Americans, so that left the settlers to use enslaved Africans to increase longevity and effective returns. Enslaved Africans were seen as a cost-effective labor source for cultivating labor-intensive crops like sugar, tobacco, rice, and cotton. The profitability of plantations relied on maximizing labor efficiency through the use of enslaved Africans. Slavery in the New World began as a type of indentured servitude where European and some enslaved Africans were able to obtain freedom. Still, history shows that European servants and Africans were treated differently. For example, if a mixed group of indentured servants ran away or got off the plantation some type of way with no intention of going back, the indentured servant of European descent would get a lighter sentence than the indentured servant of African descent. I'm not pulling this out of my butt, just to show you facts. Let's look at the John Punch case. Now, in the John Punch case, what I previously described is exactly what happened. 3 men ran away. John Punch, the African indentured servant, and 2 other European servants. Now, they ran away from Hugh Quinn's Virginia plantation because he was particularly abusive. They were caught in Maryland and sent back to Virginia where they stood trial. This is where this case gets special because at the time, in the Chesapeake region, African indentured servants were known to get longer indentured servitude sentences, but this would be the first time it will be documented. Each man received 30 lashes and a longer sentence, but John Punch's was for his entire natural life. The other 2 indentured servants were sentenced to an extra 4 years. Planters began to create measures that would specifically create connections between race and a person's social status. Over the decades, slavery evolved and became increasingly institutionalized within the legal framework and centralized in specific regions during the early colonial period. During this transformative era, the terms Negro and enslaved became synonymous, regardless of whether the individual was a freedman or enslaved. European colonizers rationalized the enslavement of Africans through racial ideologies that portrayed Africans as inherently inferior and suited only for arduous labor. These racist doctrines were instrumental in legitimizing the exploitation and dehumanization of Africans within the chattel slavery systems. The combination of legal sanctioning and entrenched social attitudes reinforced the institution of slavery, perpetuating centuries of exploitation and suffering for African peoples in the Americas. The codification of slavery into law also brings us to the slave codes. The slave codes were created with the preemptive notion that Black people in the colonies were an economic investment. The slave codes were intentional in controlling the range of motion that Black Americans had in society, condoning harm on purpose and to keep them enslaved, as well as legally and socially keeping them as the lower class. One such slave code is the Partus Sequitur Ventrum. That's a big word for Elmo. Partus Sequitur Ventrum. This was a legal doctrine passed in Colonial Virginia in 1662. This law defined that a child will take the legal status of their mother, i.e., if your mom's a slave, you are a slave. This would have a profound effect on how Black women were treated during slavery. Other slave codes, like the Virginia Slave Code of 1705, stated that it is illegal for a Black person to own a white person. A Black person was not allowed to own a weapon, and penalized those who presided over Black and white marriages with fines. Other laws also banned Black people, free or enslaved, from testifying against white people in court. The various colonies implemented their own forms of slave codes, like banning drums, banning 3 or more Africans from gathering at a time. Black Americans were not allowed outside after dark, and other things that may seem crazy now, but all were true, and all of which restricted the social range that Black people had in the colonies, both free and enslaved. But, as always, some resisted. The narrative of slavery often emphasizes the suffering endured by enslaved Africans, but woven within this dark history are limitless narratives of resistance and rebellion. From acts of individual defiance to organizing uprising, the spirit of resistance burned bright even in these chapters of resistance. For example, the Quakers, or the Religious Society of Friends, were some of the first to speak out against slavery during the 1600s. They had begun to protest against slavery. Yes, Quakers, like the Quaker Oats guy on the front of the oatmeal. Yes, they were some of the first to resist slavery in the colonies, specifically in Philly. Founded in England by George Fox during the mid-17th century, the Quakers were a branch of Christians that believed in the doctrine of the inner light, which means a direct relationship with God through Jesus Christ, which allows the person to know God's will for themselves. They also believed in the doctrine of universal priesthood of all believers, which means that God is equally accessible to all who are faithful. These doctrines were not limited to gender, creed, race, or social status. Side note, Quakerism as a whole was at the forefront of abolition, but not everybody was down for the cause. They distinguished themselves from the other groups by being completely nonviolent in their approach to ending slavery. Some Quakers participated in the slave trade, some didn't. Some tried to convert slaves to Christians, and others were like, nah, that's crazy. I'm not about that life. I'm just gonna let them free. For more information on the Quakers' views on slavery, check out Christian Slavery by Catherine Gerbner. Nevertheless, the moment for freedom for slaves had an early start in the Quaker circle. Early abolitionism among Quakers in the colonies like Pennsylvania laid a foundation of moral opposition to slavery, challenging societal norms and advocating for the rights of enslaved individuals. However, alongside these organized movements, everyday acts of resistance became integral to the survival and dignity of Black communities across the colonies. Enslaved Africans faced unimaginable cruelty and oppression, but they also found ingenious ways to resist their bondage and assert their humanity. Like the first time you fought that bastard on the horse, the tree sentinel in Elden Ring, he straight up owned me the first time. But I persisted. One form of resistance was through cultural preservation, defiance, and unintentionally, cultural transfer. Enslaved Africans maintained their traditions, languages, and spirituality as acts of defiance against their oppressors. Through music, dance, and storytelling, they found solace, strength, and unity in the face of dehumanization. Cultural transfer between the European societies and the African societies came through the form of religion. During the Great Awakening, which called for spiritual equality, Europeans thought to force Christian conversion onto slaves, but then it would make them feel guilty about enslaving Christians. And on top of that, conversion was one step closer to emancipation. And clearly, they couldn't have that. For example, Hugh Bryan, one of my favorite stories that my teacher ever told. He was a big-time slave owner in South Carolina, and he was evangelicalized by the Great Awakening. He hears God and decides, I'm going to convert all my slaves and lead them to freedom like Moses. So he heads south and eventually comes upon the Savannah River. And in order to keep going south, you have to go past the Savannah River. So this man decides that he's going to part the river like Moses. Needless to say, it didn't go that way. And he ends up almost drowning and basically getting laughed out of South Carolina. But that instance, that moment, put white people on alert. They started thinking that more people might try this, and that would pose a problem to their society. That would pose a problem to their status quo. Because this guy, Brian, was one of them. Here it is, this white dude that tried to convert all of his slaves and free them. Although it wasn't in the best way, but they had a turncoat, they had a traitor. So on the other side of this cultural transfer, we see white people also getting some of the African culture. Music was not only a means of expressing sorrow and pain, but also a tool for survival and resistance. Through spirituals, work songs, and field hollers, enslaved Africans communicated messages of hope, defiance, and solidarity. We generally think about music when it comes to cultural transfer. Rich people sometimes hired slave musicians to play European music, which they would inevitably remix and put their own spin on, as they interpreted these English ballads and other forms of music. There's also the fact that Black people were doing all the work. So what happens is we end up seeing African and African American decorating techniques on buildings, in buildings, because they are the ones doing all the work. They are asserting their humanity on the things around them because they have no other choice. We also see a cultural transfer in terms of languages. We see African tones and accents in everyday speech, specifically in the South, high concentration of slave labor. This is because rich white people had slaves to take care of their children. So well-to-do rich white people grew up with Black parental figures. So y'all may know this comedian named DC Benny. And in one of his sets, he's talking about how there's a bunch of Jamaican people in New York. So he starts talking about in the set that there's a bunch of Jamaican women raising white children. So he comes up with this story, talking about how this white lady, how the white mom is going to be like, Johnny, I'm going to get your father. And the child says, me no scared of that white boy. I always think that's funny, but that type of cultural exchange is prevalent in the colonial South. Enslaved Africans also used everyday forms of resistance, such as feigning illness, slowing down their work pace, or breaking tools. Some also resorted to more direct action against their enslavers, including arson, poison, or organized rebellions. So first, we're going to talk about the Stonewall Rebellion. The Stonewall Rebellion happened in South Carolina and was one of the largest slave uprisings in colonial America. First, a little pretext on the Stonewall Rebellion. The white settlers in the southern colonies were concerned with their ops, the Spanish. The Spanish sent out a proclamation that said any slaves that came to the Spanish-controlled Florida will be considered free. This proclamation alarmed some of the slave owners because some slaves had already escaped Florida, and the slave masters couldn't have their investments running away now, could they? Slave owners were also terrified of a rebellion because the enslaved population clearly outnumbered the white settlers. Between enslaved people still being brought to the colonies and black people being born in the New World, the white folks didn't know what to do. The southern colonies clearly wanted the slave labor to grow their cash crops like tobacco and rice. Slave owners did whatever they could to keep the enslaved Africans in check, like slave patrols and promoting obedience to Christianity, but violence and whippings were the most effective. So, South Carolina decided to pass the Security Act in 1739. Now, the Security Act of 1739 stated that planters had to go to church armed in case of a slave revolt. Now, on Sundays, the enslaved Africans were free from their work and free from white people because they were at church. This brings us to Sunday, September 9th, 1739, in Charleston, South Carolina, near the Stonewall River, when an enslaved African by the name of Jimmy began his march. See, Jimmy is believed to be an Angolan warrior before he was enslaved. So we know that he wasn't going to put up with the abuse and neglect from his Charleston planters. Sometime after midnight, Jimmy and his companions, approximately 20 enslaved Africans, seized weapons from a nearby shop. It's the Hutcherson shop, and they killed the two shopkeepers. Jimmy and his men began their march towards St. Augustine, Florida, where they believed they could find freedom. Along the way, they gathered more recruits, killing men, women, and children, as well as burning down some houses until the revolt grew to involve about 100 enslaved people. These attacks weren't random. The enslaved Africans had an idea of who they wanted to kill. For example, a local tavern owner was spared because he was known to treat his slaves nicely. Some of the enslaved Africans even protected slave masters, like the Quaker man Thomas Eliot. The rebellion was eventually suppressed by local militia near the Edisto River, resulting in the deaths of many rebels and others sold off to the West Indies. We're not sure what happened to Jimmy. The rebellion heightened fears among the enslavers of future rebellions. After the rebellion, white colonists quickly enacted harsher slave codes and stricter control measures like the Negro Act. The Negro Act stated that it was illegal for slaves to move abroad, assemble in groups, raise food, earn money, and learn to read and write English. Because think about it. How did Jimmy know what the proclamation said? He had to know how to read. Another significant rebellion during this time was the Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner was born into slavery in Southampton County, Virginia in the 1800s. Turner grew up deeply religious and believed that he was chosen by God to lead his people out of bondage. So, in August 1831, Turner and a group of fellow enslaved individuals initiated a rebellion against their enslavers. Over the course of 2 days, they moved from plantation to plantation, gathering supporters and freeing slaves. The rebellion resulted in the deaths of around 55 to 65 white people, including men, women, and children. The uprising was eventually suppressed by local militia, leading to the capture and execution of Turner and many of his followers. In retaliation, white mobs indiscriminately killed scores of enslaved and free African Americans across Virginia. Nat Turner's rebellion sent a shockwave through the South, striking fear into the hearts of slave owners and galvanizing the abolitionist movements across the country. Nat Turner's rebellion symbolized the deep-seated resistance of enslaved individuals against their oppressors and inspired subsequent generations to fight for freedom and equality, while also highlighting the brutal realities of slavery. So, in conclusion, life in colonial America was Dark Souls level difficult, but life for Black people during this time had to be Dark Souls PvP difficult, where someone keeps remapping the buttons every few seconds on the controller that keeps disconnecting from the console, all while trying to fight some laggy jerk that keeps backstabbing you from a mile in front of you. I'm beyond irritated thinking about it. But that just goes to show you the life for Black people in colonial America was marked with profound inequality, oppression, and resilience. Enslaved individuals endured brutal conditions and were denied basic human rights and exploited for economic gain. Free Black people faced legal discrimination, economic hardships, and social exclusion despite their efforts to build communities and secure their freedoms. If you take nothing from this episode, take this. Slavery evolved from indentured servitude to chattel slavery, the turning point being the John Punch case, which led to the codification of Black people being lifelong slaves into society and law, which led to the slave codes. There were some who resisted through cultural and intellectual means, and others who were more direct in their dissatisfaction with slavery. The enslaved also resisted in everyday life. Alright, that wraps up today's episode. Thank you for joining. I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to drop a like and consider following the podcast for more content like this. As always, I welcome your feedback and suggestions for future topics. Until next time, peace.